Welcome to the Impact Learning Visionaries podcast, where we celebrate the unsung heroes of the learning and development industry. As always, we'll be bringing some laughter and a bit of fun along the way, but more importantly, you'll get some incredible insights, key lessons, and unique perspectives on everything related and possibly unrelated to training and development. Let's get this show on the road. Hi everybody, and welcome to the Impact Learning Visionaries podcast. And today I have with me Karen Hidden, who is my kind of co-pilot on my other podcast, which is called Virtual Reality or Immersive Technology in Business. So please go check it out. But for today, what I thought we would do is just queue up this new podcast that we're launching called Impact Learning Visionaries. And Karen's role today is she is going to essentially be turning the tables on me, where I'm normally the one asking the question. Karen is going to be in the driving seat today. But I thought just before I hand over to her is just talk a little bit about what this concept of impact learning is all about. And it stems from the core challenge today, which I believe we all love to learn. My career, and I'm sure that very few people are different here, is been driven by this desire to master and become a master of our area of expertise, whatever that might be, and anything from a software developer to a human resources manager to a CEO. We follow a career path that is very much cemented in a learning and development process. And the stat I came across about a year ago has sat with me, and it's really galvanized this whole idea of impact learning. And that is that everybody is doing training, everybody is learning, yet we from time to time step back, put our head above water, because it's a pretty chaotic world we live in. We're all super busy. And the stat in question was a stat that came out of a Gartner survey a few years ago. And that stat was that in every organization today, 7 out of 10 people in that organization believe that they lack the mastery of skills to do their job effectively. And that's despite them wanting to learn. And fast forward a couple of years, and a study done by PwC about a year and a half ago is that the pace of change in the world today means that that's just exacerbated. We're seeing in that PwC report, 77% of people are saying that they just don't have the relevant skills needed to do their jobs. So the question is why? Why are people struggling with this concept? And one of the big challenges, and one of the things that I've really thought deeply about is this concept of we all love learning. We all want to improve. We all want to achieve mastery. But yet, when it comes to the actual process of learning, that almost, for want of a better word, education, is I kind of see that's where we fall down. We have these aspirational desires to want to improve ourselves, and then we take a look, for instance, at statistics from e-learning and see that on average only 5 to 15% of people end up completing a course that they've started. And somewhere along the way, something has gone wrong. And I think that's where the heart of this challenge lies, in almost the way that we learn, and how that is essentially fundamentally not working for us at the moment. So there are ways that we know we all like to learn, and that's learning by doing. And there's so many different models out there that essentially accentuate that most of the learning actually happens on the job. So for those of you in the learning industry, you would probably have come across the 70-20-10 model. There's a lot of companies that are focusing on mentorship, which is a way to galvanize and reinforce the more traditional styles of learning that are being done in those organizations that essentially, if we had to be very blunt and very honest, aren't working. And there's a lot of scaffolding that gets put in place to try and alleviate the symptoms of that lack of effective training. So the big challenge is, if we know that the best way to learn is experientially, then why aren't we seeing more experiential learning in the marketplace today? And I think therein lies the challenge, because experiential learning, although it's the best way to learn, is often the hardest type of learning to do. And there's a myriad of different reasons for that. So I'll hand over to Cara now, who will effectively ask me really wonderful questions.
Wield my power over you. So I think two things. You mentioned the 70-20-10, so maybe you want to dive a little bit into that, so kind of what that actually means for some of the listeners. And then I would like you to also just talk about why, so we know experiential learning is so important, but why is it so difficult to do it properly in today's world?
All right, perfect. So I'm by no means an expert, so you've kind of put me a little bit on the spot with the 70-20-10 model. But essentially, it's a ratio that we apply to essentially, and correct me if I'm wrong here, because I will probably get this wrong. It's been a while since I've looked at exactly what this model is. But 10% is where you would do your traditional kind of rote learning. And then the 20% is where I always get a little bit fuzzy. So the 20%, I believe, is where you kind of almost apply that learning to a degree. And then the 70% is where you are essentially learning on the job. So,
yes.
Corin, correct me. I know I butchered that horribly. So maybe you actually want to come in and rescue me and actually explain what 70% actually is.
No, you were like about 90% spot on. So we could call it the 90-70-20-10. So yeah, so 10% here is through kind of our formal traditional learning. Kind of 20% is in when we learn through others, when we're sitting around talking about it. So that might also be a teacher explaining it to class, whereas the 10 is kind of reading a text. And then 100%. The 70% is what people learn through experiences. So that learning by doing. So it might be, you and I have spoken about it before, where you learn how to ride a bike, where you're actually learning to ride that bike, or changing a car tire. You're the one who's physically having to do that. But why is that experiential learning so difficult to do in a corporate space? You mentioned the mentorship, which is also part of it. But if we know that that's the best way to learn, and we've been doing it since we were little, why is it so difficult? Why are we not doing it in organizations now?
Well, Karen, I'm glad you asked.
Yes, I teed that up quite nicely.
Thank you. So I think there's two reasons why experiential learning isn't more prevalent. The first is that generally when we learn through experience, the kind of answer lies in the actual phrase experiential learning. You need someone with experience to teach the person who doesn't have experience. I mean, you can imagine, if you go back to that riding a bike, if I was learning how to ride a bike from someone who didn't know how to ride a bike, it would be probably entertaining to watch, but pretty disastrous. And what you really why that works is that you have a parent who is obviously knows how to ride a bicycle and is really showing the child through a series of trial and error how to build and grow that muscle memory that is going to essentially allow them to ride a bike. And the reality is as we get to more complex things, like riding a bike is a very easy example because generally most parents know how to ride a bike and they can impart that knowledge on a very kind of simple 1-to-1, or depending on how many kids you have, 1-to-10 ratio. The same would be true probably for swimming. A lot of parents will be able to teach their kids to swim. But when we get to more complex things where the level of complexity is much higher, there's fewer experts in the industry. And then it really becomes a challenge of how people get access to those experts, especially when they're geographically dispersed, or, those experts come at an incredibly expensive fee. And the challenge with that is even in those organizations that are able to bring those experts in and do the training, that comes with two key challenges. It's either that is an external consultant who basically requires you to forego some other kind of organ to be able to pay for the experience, or more often is the case, you end up with someone inside the organization who is the expert, who is a value generating person in that organization, having to step away from critical work or revenue generating work to take time out to go and explain and teach the people. And sometimes what happens is that you get people who are good teachers and people who are really bad teachers. And often the kind of more subtle challenge is that experts often are the worst teachers because they lack that beginner mindset, and they try and teach people through, kind of, pardon the phrase, blunt force trauma, by kind of getting them to understand all of the complexity all at once. It's overwhelming, and the person comes out the other side with like kind of a nervous tick and a deer in the headlights.
Yeah, if they come out at all. But yeah,
yes.
I agree.
So the other thing is that, okay, so that then, kind of talks about the second part, which is the scalability. And I think the reason that the school system was designed in the first place was to deal with scale. Is every parent can't homeschool their children. There's a kind of economy that we live in, which means that we ultimately came up with these experts called teachers, and their job is to train kids. But the reality is, to be able to train kids experientially is impossible in that scenario, because if you've got a classroom of 20 kids, it's just not practical or feasible to have that real one-on-one interaction. And in the corporate world, that just takes it reaches the next stage of evolution, which is, how do we solve radical scale, and what the education industry and the learning and development industry has done to solve that is to create digital learning or e-learning. And that's even less scalable. I mean, even less experiential, but radically scalable. So we sit with almost this continuum of from experiential to non-experiential learning, and it's a diametrically opposed scale to scalability, where the more scale you want to introduce, the less experiential the learning becomes. And I think that's the challenge with why we don't see more experiential learning today.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. And so, not that you would tell all of our guests this, but you have got a wealth of experience in a range of organizations, and equally around learning and development. Where do you feel you have seen, or where you feel that you've made an impact in your career around this experiential learning or learning and development?
So there's a few areas, I think. One is, I think there's been some experiences which I think have come agonizingly close to experiential learning. And they've done that in clever ways by blending e-learning with a cohort-based approach, where you kind of end up learning from other people on the cohort. And a great example of that one is Seth Godin's Alt MBA,
Yes.
where you're not subjected to a whole bunch of videos and kind of rote learning. Instead, what what happens there is you're thrown into the deep end, and you're actually learning from your cohort, which is a small group of people. So you have that ability to learn through their experiences. But
I mean, you were actually on that, right?
Still, I was, yeah.
Yeah.
But
And I remember
it's still
you
not
saying,
experiential learning. It's still for me a case of that almost the 10 or 20 of that 70-20-10, because you still have to go back into your own organization afterwards and apply some of these learnings, and that still comes with that curve of that confidence curve, as I kind of generally refer to it, is whenever you have to start something new, you feel like either an imposter or you feel anxious because you haven't had the experience of doing it a few times. But if we then move on from there, I guess one of the most interesting traditional courses I've done is a negotiation course, where it was a small group of people who were all learning about negotiation skills through almost an acting methodology, where the person teaching it would behave in different ways at different times of their training to almost kind of trick your brain into behaving in that similar style. So it was like kind of a mirroring experience. Is this person was looking at zero-sum negotiation versus partnership-based negotiation, and when we're getting to the zero-sum stuff, he was behaving, in a very cold manner. And I remember, just being able to try experiments in that learning and learning with a cohort, where at least you came out the other side thinking, I've tried a little bit of everything and I know what works for me and what doesn't work for me. But I think hands down the best example of experiential learning I've seen is through virtual reality experiences. And why I say that is, yes, nothing really can beat learning from the wise old sage master. I mean, I've done martial arts for many years in my life, and I would never liken or say that the experience would be better if I learned from a textbook or a YouTube video.
Sure.
One of the most valuable parts is having that sifu who is there training you, every week and correcting your form and telling you when you're doing things in an inefficient way. So I don't believe that there's any learning that can beat that one-on-one experience. But we live in a three-dimensional world, and traditional learning is all done in two dimensions. And what makes the riding the bike experience, the swimming experience, the martial arts experience different for me is that we are learning in a three-dimensional way.
Yeah.
And what I think virtual reality does is, and the experiences that I've seen, is that we can essentially mirror a three-dimensional world in virtual reality, and using the controllers, which is essentially an extension of your hands, we can essentially achieve the same type of movements that we would in the real world around us, which builds that muscle memory. And it's nothing new. I mean, airline pilots have been doing this for decades.
Yeah.
Just think about it. The first time an airline pilot actually does their job, they have 300 lives sitting behind them in the plane. So you don't get much higher stakes than that. And they, and I remember a lovely story with a friend of mine who was traveling with her father, and they went through a heavy bout of turbulence. And she was a nervous flyer, and she was freaking out, as you would if you're a nervous flyer in turbulence. And I remember she told me her father very gently leaned over to her and said, "At times like this, I have to believe the pilot wants to live as much as I do." So the reality there is we're not doing anything new with virtual reality.
Yeah.
We're essentially mirroring an industry who has had to get it right because the stakes are so high.
So high, yeah.
And yeah, and in these experiences, everything from hard skills like learning how to repair an engine on a car, or change a braking system on a semi truck, or changing the fuel and doing maintenance on an aeroplane, through to soft skills training, being able to deal with conflict resolution management, being able to communicate effectively, being able to know what to say when, to things that we really struggle to teach, like sales skills.
Even to your point earlier, the negotiations, and also the sales skills. Nobody can really learn that unless you're having to go through it.
Yeah.
But it also sounds
and
like...
I think the other side to why I like virtual reality is because it's very accessible now. So I just need to have a headset, and I can essentially learn as many times as I want to.
And I guess that's also where I just think that that's also where it comes into the whole scale, and then also being able to make those mistakes as many times as possible. Is that
exactly
a fair comment to make?
Yeah, so I mean, we come almost full circle back to that first statistic of 7 out of 10 people lacking the mastery of skills to do their job. Mastery is achieved not by rote learning, and in many cases not even through application of learning. Mastery is achieved by doing it multiple times until you achieve mastery. So if I go back to the martial arts example, it's I can sit in a class and I can learn the right way to do a form, or the right way to punch. But the chances are, after the first week, I'll be pretty lousy at it. I know all the theory. I've applied it. I've practiced it. But if I were then faced with a real life situation with someone who actually knew how to do the same type of system or a different system, I would probably end up on my back.
Yeah.
But by that reinforced learning, doing it week after week after week, consistently, we achieve mastery. And for me, that's where virtual reality becomes a really, really exceptional tool, because in many ways we have access to that wise sage in a virtual reality experience. We have access to that three-dimensional world that we can safely go into as many times as we want to be able to do whatever we're applying from a learning perspective again and again and again. And it's easy, because if I was using the engine example, if I wanted to learn how to essentially fix a braking system, and diagnose something, how would I do that? I would realistically have to wait till a customer brought in a car with that exact issue, and then say, oh, I recognize that issue. I'm not confident yet, but I'm going to try and fix it. And then the senior mechanic behind me would go, just get out the way. I'm going to show you how to do it. Whereas now in virtual reality, I can start from any configuration automatically that I want to learn in. So I can have that situation repeated 10, 15, 100 times if I want to, without fear of making mistakes, getting it wrong, having that senior mechanic kind of scooch me out the way to say, let me just do it myself. I build up that confidence, I build up that mastery. And in many times, people who have learned through VR, we'll see the kind of comparative of someone who's learned through even applied learning versus someone who's learned through VR. When you take a look at them post that learning experience in the real world, doing what they've learned, you'll take a look at the first time they're both doing that same task. You'll look at the one in VR and you'll say, sure, it's almost like that guy's done it before.
Yeah, that's really powerful. So, I mean, it sounds like what you're saying is that it's become exceptional and accessible in terms of VR and its reach. Tell me, Jason, so when it comes to learning and development, what is your aspirational goal with regards to this industry and this area?
So I want to essentially help companies achieve value from learning and development. I think that a lot of times we we think we're doing the right things in learning and development, but essentially we're not measuring we're not measuring the effectiveness.
Yeah.
And I think that's true in my personal case. Many times that I've done some form of learning and development in my past, I had a myriad of different results and different outcomes, but never once was that learning and development given in such a way that I was measured on a key outcome of the business that I was in. So no one ever validated that the learning I went on in any way made me more effective, helped me realize that I had mastered something, and showed me how I was contributing to the overall success of the business. And we see lots of statistics which talk about, companies with employees who have more mastery are 20% on average more profitable than others. But that's, again, it's too amorphous a statistic. And I think that there's this idea or this philosophy in medicine called the N of one, which is that, we treat people a little bit like cattle in medicine.
Yeah.
And at best we might get to different kind of cultural groups. But generally, when I go to a doctor, they don't often tend to look at my unique profile and ask me my history and my genetics and my kind of personal situation. They'll look at me, they'll look at what the general response is to whatever that symptom is, and then they will give me the answer to that.
Yeah.
And I think that we have the information and we have the data to do better in medicine and to do better in learning and development.
Yeah.
So my goal is to help bring this concept of impact learning, is being able to say, how do we change the way that we speak about learning from, instead of being so-and-so needs to go on X course, to being able to say so-and-so needs to achieve the following outcome in their business, drive the following metric. And the best way to do that is by doing the following experiential process.
Yeah.
And that's not even a course I'm talking about. It's being able to actually have something that's specifically tailored to the outcome of that person. And even like, I love the word personalized, because yes, there's a degree of personalization, but the personalization is not necessarily the defining factor. I mean, there are very specific ways to do things. Organizations are defined on processes and procedures. The industry is defined on norms and kind of applications of process. So it's not like I'm advocating that everybody has to learn something unique and different, but I'm saying we're all in different places in our career, and it's almost like we each have our own recipe that we need to follow, and we need to be able to understand firstly what the company's requirement is, and then work backwards from there to say, well, what is my specific need to be able to meet that requirement, and what is my specific recipe. And this is why things like just-in-time learning are going to be the wave of the future. And we're seeing it in AI at the moment. Is people are starting to realize that AI is the kind of new ultimate automation. This augmented intelligence instead of artificial intelligence, of being able to have even more information than we had in the internet age through an internet browser. We've suddenly got even more information and more augmented information. And then the missing piece to me is just how we learn in a way that is experiential and that mirrors the real world. And we know, for instance, for one example, virtual reality tricks our brains and makes us think that the virtual worlds that we're in mirror the real worlds, and it's a really, really effective way of learning. But virtual reality is not the only way to learn, and it shouldn't be seen as a silver bullet and everything should now be done in immersive technologies and virtual reality. I think there's a space for blended learning. So I think in big, hairy, audacious goal would be to help people just change the way that they think about learning, be able to embrace new technologies, be adaptive in utilizing these new technologies, think it was in 1913, Thomas Edison said, motion pictures were going to change education forever, and in 10 years there would be no classrooms. Well, that went really well.
Very well. Who cares what he said? So Jason, from your extreme range of experience, what is that one little grain of advice that you would want to give other leaders who want to make an impact in this space through impact learning and development? What is that kind of one little bit that you think they all need to know?
I think it's a tough question because there's many little bits, but I think that from this perspective, it would be how can we essentially make learning bring real value to our businesses and to our careers. How do we take like learning and development and education away from this kind of general space into something that we actually love? And I think that the frustrating thing is there's such a disconnect between our desire to want to learn, our desire to want to achieve mastery, and the way we get there. And I think that if we can fix that, the system will almost correct itself.
Yeah. It's bringing back that love for learning. It's almost tragic that it isn't happening, but there is a way to do it, as you've explained.
And to be more specifically, the love of doing it. I think we all have the intrinsic desire to actually want to improve, want to be better. But it's that the missing piece for me is how we get from point A to point B.
Yeah,
and
taking that step. Yeah. And I've got one final question before I hand over to you to do the closing and your final sing and dance. But what is a book that you're reading or a podcast that you're listening to that you think everybody else should listen to or read?
I'm going to actually give you the most probably defining book I've ever read on the subject of organizational learning, strategy, and the one that I probably referenced the most often. And I've actually just read it again recently. Even though it's an old book, it's still like an absolute gem. And that is Peter Singer's The Fifth Discipline. And the reason I love that book so much is because it understands that the world we live in and the organizations we work in are complex. And where I think a lot of people get a little bit intimidated by that complexity. If you understand how to navigate complexity, you can really be effective in these complex environments. And then, it goes from that kind of underlying systems thinking approach into really, really incredible ways to understand how to be effective in those types of environments, how to create a shared vision and how to take people along for that journey. And then finishes off with something that I've been a huge fan of for my entire life, which is this concept of personal mastery and being a lifelong learner and realizing that if there's one universal truth besides death and taxes at the moment, it's that everything is going to change. And we need to adapt to be able to be effective in a world of constant change. And
we don't have to be scared. We shouldn't be scared. We should be brave enough to embrace that change.
Well, unless, of course, a singularity happens and all those basically doomsayers were right and you end up basically becoming batteries overlords. So actually, my best advice was be nice to AI right now, because one day they could be our evil overlords.
When you're asking Siri for a song, just say please. I think that's what I always tend to do. She answers back a lot nicer. Jason, it's been such a treat getting to interview you on the podcast. I'm going to hand back to you to do our closing. But maybe what we could do when we post the podcast is just put a link to that book that you spoke about. I think that would be really helpful to all of the listeners.
Perfect. Thank you, Karen. It's actually been quite relieving being actually interviewed by someone else for a change. I like it. I like it a lot. So thank you everyone for watching or listening. Hopefully you've now got a better understanding of what this concept of impact learning is. And going forward, we're going to be speaking to people who are making a big difference in the learning and development industry, understanding their stories, because I'm fascinated about people's stories and about their journeys. And I think that, you know, there's so much value hidden inside the journeys that people have gone through in their lives, and being able to kind of almost pull out those individual nuggets of wisdom and be able to share them with everybody, I think is an incredible gift. So I can't wait for us to get started and to share our journeys of all the people who are going to be spending time with us. So thank you very much for listening, and stay tuned. Hey, thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Impact Learning Visionaries. If you found it interesting or helpful, please subscribe by clicking on the button down below so you don't miss our next one. Also, be sure to check out our Reality Bites blog for more information on how technology is aiding in learning development. Links are all in the description below. Go check it out. Thanks a lot. Bye.